If someone asked you what was one of the causes for the end of World War I or World War II, do you think you would have said the rubber tree? Maybe, but I doubt it. The rubber tree was actually one of many causes that contributed to the end of World War I and World War II, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Of course, the rubber tree had many other important impacts on civilization, but we're going to focus on World War I and World War II. And before we do that, I'll just briefly share with you a little bit about the tree, its origin, and kind of bring us to the modern day. And then we can focus on World War I and World War II, which is really quite a fascinating story. So firstly, the tree itself, Hevea brasiliensis, thought to be about 100 to 140 foot tall at max in wild, which is the rainforest, and also colonies that were controlled by British and other spots in Southeast Asia now. And what was special about this tree is it had latex vessels in the bark, and had about 30% rubber. And although there are other plants that produce latex, and we'll hit upon some of them in this course, none of them were as popular for producing natural rubber as the rubber tree, because it really produced a good amount from each tree. In terms of where it originated, the para rubber tree, as it was known, initially grew in the Amazon rainforest. And of course, like many plants we'll learn about in this course, seeds were taken, stolen, various intrigues from history, and ended up in British colonies where they could be grown in climates that were suitable for them. The natives were thought to use natural rubber for containers, shoes, waterproofing fabrics, and there was a Mesoamerican game that involved a solid rubber ball, which you can see in this image. This is a modern reenactment of the game. So if we flash forward to the 18th century or the 1700s, I just wanted to point out that a large theme in this lesson is going to be tires. And so before we get to the tires we all know and love that involve rubber, actually synthetic rubber, which we'll also talk about, this was kind of your typical wheel in the 1700s. They were usually wooden, and the tires themselves were usually iron. And this created a whole host of problems, from how much weight they could bear to how often they broke, how they could handle uneven surfaces, especially mud. So these were some of the challenges leading into the 1800s and this real drive for inventors to try to change natural rubber into a substance with slightly different properties. So the properties of natural rubber are not what we usually think of. So we think of rubber products as lasting a lifetime, but that's actually synthetic rubber that's long-lasting. Natural rubber is not stable. It's actually sticky in hot weather, hard and brittle in the cold, and too soft to be long-lasting. So you can imagine those are not ideal properties for the different applications that we use rubber for today. And so two important men I'll highlight are both tire icons that help change natural rubber to become something closer to what we think of as for rubber that is used now, synthetic rubber. And so first is Charles Goodyear. You'll recognize the name Goodyear. He's spent years switching between experimenting on rubber and jail time due to indebtedness. And in 1839, when he was experimenting and trying to obtain a certain result, something else happened, and it's thought that he accidentally discovered vulcanization at that time, which changed the properties of rubber in a very positive way for our modern applications. It made the rubber elastic, water impermeable, gas tight, so it could hold gases inside, and tear resistant. And he patented in the process in 1844. And interestingly, Charles Goodyear actually died with a $200,000 debt. And so although the Goodyear family itself became a large company and family that is known to be associated with tires, Charles Goodyear himself did not benefit. Tire icon 2 is John Dunlop. In 1887, he was credited with developing the first practical pneumatic tire for his son's tricycle, actually. So there were other people trying to work on pneumatic tires, or tires that had air in them, but he's the one who's credited with having the first practical one that most modeled tires after. In 1888, He obtained a patent and in 1889 formed the Dunlop Pneumatic Tire Company. So it won't surprise you to know that he's a Brit, from Great Britain, based on how he spelled tire. And that's just a picture of him as an old man on a bike in 1915. So all of this leads us up to World War I. So a lot of these patents were in the late 1800s, and then tires and tires for automobiles were all refined between then and the time leading up to World War I. And there were lots of uses for rubber that were important in the war effort. Here's some, and I'll tell you a few more in a little bit. Rubber gaskets, tubes, driving belts, really important for, components of automobiles or other moving vehicles, tanks, etc. Waterproof clothing and shoes, cable insulation, battery cases, medical gloves, and of course, tires are the big dog. To give you a sense for how much tire production ramped up leading up to World War I, which is thought to have accelerated the trend. It's estimated there were about 10,000 cars worldwide in 1900, and by 1914 about 2.5 million cars. And some U.S. companies and European companies that were around in the U.S. included U.S. Rubber, and then 3 you'll recognize, Goodrich, Goodyear, and Firestone. And then European companies included Dunlop out of Great Britain, Michelin out of France, and Continental out of Germany, which you'll also recognize. And a big supplier of rubber that had 41% of the market share in 1915 was British Malaya. And this is an example of a British colony where seeds from the Amazon were brought so that rubber trees could be grown. And it's thought that new railroads were built and clearance of tropical forests were accelerated for rubber, for tires, and other items. So others I didn't mention because I didn't want the list to be too long. Gas masks, very important. Many of you probably already know that chemical warfare was a big part of World War I. You can see a gas mask in the lower right there. My own great-grandfather, who was in Scotland the time, was in World War I, and he was gassed and survived and had lifelong lung problems as a result. So they weren't perfect, but it was probably better to have them than to not have them. Other items, balloons for military reconnaissance, blimps for anti-submarine warfare, and one that you won't be surprised by but might not have thought of, rubber condoms, which were mainly in response to venereal disease for soldiers. Obviously, condoms were a bit dicey as an item for sale, since that was kind of thought immoral, to be using such a thing, but it became apparent it was necessary to have for soldiers so that you don't have venereal diseases taking out people that could be fighting in battle. So this is why rubber was important. It was really the lack of rubber for Central Powers, including Germany, that really caused some problems during the war. It wasn't the only one, but one big contributor. So it's thought that until about the fall of 1914, Germany was buying rubber on London markets through neutral parties, but then after Great Britain declared war, the Central Powers were practically cut off from the international rubber market until really like war's end. And the U.S. also stepped in. The U.S. tire industry brought most of Britain's Southeast Asian rubber production under their control, while Great Britain was engaged with Germany, and from then on, most of the rubber cargo was directly sent to U.S. harbors, and so during the war, I think they were estimating between 40 to 70% of global rubber purchases were coming from the U.S. between 1914 and 1918 via, the Southeast Asian rubber plantations. And so Germans worked on synthetic rubber technologies, but the products were too brittle. And German trucks drove on iron tires in the last years of the war, which you could imagine would be really challenging, and muddy terrain was considered one problem among many. So not having rubber was not a great thing. And just so it's, in case you weren't clear, the rubber that was created via vulcanization and other stuff changed the properties of natural rubber into something else that could be used and applied, but you still needed natural rubber from the rubber tree to get to that point. So the Germans were trying to actually literally create rubber without involving the rubber tree, but it just wasn't working at this time in history. So World War II, let's flash forward. One would hope that rubber wouldn't have the same kind of effects as it did in World War I, but as you will see, there's some important things that happened here too, because still, however many years later, 30 or so years later, synthetic rubber was not quite ready, and so folks were still relying on the natural rubber tree. So let's just show you a quick few minutes of a film so that you can see. This is a propaganda film, of course, but it gives you a sense for just how important rubber was. So we'll just watch the first 2.5 minutes or so.
In 1940, Hitler made his great bid for the domination of Europe. His armies smashed across the borders of the Netherlands, Belgium, France. In 1940, Hitler looked towards the Eiffel Tower in Paris, and beyond it, towards another tower, the Statue of Liberty. 4 years later, this happened to him. American wheels started rolling through the cities of France, rolling east towards Berlin. This is the Red Ball Express. This one-way highway is a revolution in the science of military supply. It starts at the beaches of Normandy and extends for hundreds of miles, past Paris and into the front lines of battle. Over it, in a never-ending stream, thousands of American trucks are highballing to victory. The dozens of thousands of tires on the Red Ball speed along, averaging 40 miles an hour round the clock. Over this great turnpike, American tires carrying American equipment have changed the tide of war. These trucks are rolling on endlessly. These trucks, as well as these bombers. On heavy shoes, they speed along the runway. On spinning rubber, they lift their loads into the air, day after day, night after night. While these trucks and planes strike at Germany from the west, Russia squeezes the Nazis back from the east. Here, too, American Lend-Lease trucks, rolling on American Lend-Lease tires, are on the job. In Italy, heavy guns on giant tires are wheeled into position. Mobile artillery rolling with the Fifth Army up the boot. No war has ever moved as much as this one. It moves on tires.
So you get the general impression. This is pretty cool, but we'll acknowledge, right? Definitely a propaganda video. The U.S. entered the war a bit later than some other countries, so there were a lot of other countries fighting Germany before we came in too, but still, I think it's cool because it does highlight just how important, in this case they're really focused on tires, because if you watch the whole thing, which you can if you like, the link's right there, it's definitely kind of supporting companies in the U.S. that produce tires and stuff like that. But there's lots of other products, as you can imagine, that rubber was useful for during the war, and it's not quite as simple as they paint in this video. So let's flesh it out just a little bit more. So first of all, we have to remember World War II also involved the East. So Japan was part of the equation, and Japan was having challenges of its own for similar reasons as Germany. So it couldn't obtain its oil and rubber within its sphere of influence. And it actually received most of its rubber from British Malaya. and Britain was attempting to restrict Japan's expansion. And rubber, of course, was necessary because the pneumatic tire was used by all forms of ground and air transportation, as that video highlighted. However, Japan was able to easily overrun Malaya once Great Britain was engaged with Germany, but there was one force that could have stopped them, and that would be the American Pacific Fleet, which was at Pearl Harbor. And so some of this is a little contested, but it is thought that this was one reason, anyway, that Japan thought it was a good idea to bomb Pearl Harbor. It's very true if you read about the attitudes of Americans leading up to entering the war, that they didn't really want to be involved, even knowing some of the news they were hearing coming out of Europe. World War I was still pretty recent in mind, and so wasn't a lot of interest in joining up. And so the Japanese military thought destroying the Pacific Fleet would kind of cause America to give up and allow Japan to control Asia and kind of just keep out of it. But of course, we had the opposite reaction. So it was December 7th, 1941, as many of you know. Japan attacked the fleet at Pearl Harbor while simultaneously attacking other Southeast Asian locations, including British Malaya. And this is really cool. This is a view from the Japanese fighter plane at Pearl Harbor. And so once this happened, there was lots of rationing going on in the U.S. due to the war, but rubber was definitely part of the equation. So every bit of scrap rubber was useful. The U.S. knew that there was a lot of turbulence in the world and that it wasn't for sure a guarantee they were going to have rubber imports, so they had stockpiled quite a lot of rubber. But at the rate that we used it, it wasn't going to last forever. And so this is a cool ad that highlights how much a gas mask requires, a life raft, a scout car, a heavy bomber. And so encouraging people to, be thrifty, keep their scrap rubber together. And so Liberia is another country of interest in this story. It actually became important to the U.S. for its rubber producing capacity since Southeast Asia was under Japanese control. And there was some challenges there. Germany had ties to Liberia because it was a major trading partner from 1910 to 1943. Most of the doctors on the island were of German descent. It's actually a place that was liberated by freed slaves. It's a really interesting country. And here's an ad from there. This is from Firestone, where they're basically saying, hey, we produce rubber in Liberia, national pride, buy our tires, could be the summary. You could read through the whole ad if you like. So that was a challenge, right? So Liberia, we kind of looked there. Liberia, can we use this connection, or is this going to be problematic because of the German influence? So there's actually some famous photos of a diplomatic move made by President Roosevelt. He actually visited Liberia, and in 1943, this is when he made that move, knowing that it was a strategic place to maybe have a stable rubber supply. And so once this happened, Germans again were left without a source of natural rubber. So same story as World War I. And other sources of rubber were thought. They even tried dandelions. Some of you may know you can get a small amount of latex out of dandelions. And synthetic rubber development was also explored. But it was actually the U.S., through the synthetic rubber program, that actually had this achievement. And so this is actually in Akron, Ohio. There's a historical landmark. And you can actually click the link in the bottom left if you want to look at this whole document. But basically, in this period, 1939 to 1945, some really brilliant minds were brought together and they were charged with the task. We need synthetic rubber. We need it now. This is going to be, what really ultimately matters for ending this war. And so miraculously, and just as a show of if you put enough energy and time at a problem, you can see that in this case, the problem was actually solved. And so synthetic rubber actually came on the scene. So many other things happened too. Rubber wasn't the only piece of the story, but the war was over, as you know. They show you in the bottom left, Wilhelm Keitel is signing the German instrument of surrender. So eventually the war did come to an end. And so while no one's going to claim rubber was the sole reason World War II came to an end, it's interesting to consider that this tree out of the Amazon rainforest did have a role to play in this war. The last thing I'll just share is that there are lots of these really cool plant books out there that have a lot of cool history weaved with plant biology and other things for plants that really had like a big impact on civilization. And so here's one example. So if you found this interesting and you want to know more about the rubber tree throughout history, because it has lots of cool things that you can learn about, here's a book, Tears of the Tree, The Story of Rubber, a Modern Marvel. So check it out if you want to learn more. And lastly, but not least, here are the references. And this is only like a 20-minute little history story lesson here. And for just 20 minutes, I've got about 6 bolded references. Those are where like the information came from. And then the rest are all the photo credits. So none of this is common knowledge. And so always referencing is a really positive thing. So you can verify that I've shared good information with you.